Good morning to everyone that's joining us so far. To Roger, Manogue, I see Tim from Cape Town, Sipo from Eswatini, we've got Paco from Botswana, Gilbert, Leon, Pumla. It's really good to see lots of familiar names coming up in the chat room. My name is Vikeshni. It's been a while since I've hosted a session, so I'm very excited to see everyone online this morning. So today we've got our Boardroom Governance Forum paper presentation on organizational culture and the board. We've got a wonderful team of panelists today, and if I can ask them to put their videos on. So before I hand over to Anton, and who will introduce all our panelists this morning, I just wanted to let anyone who hasn't joined us before for a webinar know that you can use the chat room, which everybody's using right now, to say hello, let everyone know where you're from, and to put in general comments. If you would like to ask, though, a specific question to our panel, please can you put that in the Q&A. You'll see on your menu tab at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. If you click that, you pop your question in and we can see those questions on our side. This just makes sure we actually see your questions and they don't get lost in the chat. We'll also allow members to voice their questions as well. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. And when we get to the Q&A, I'll help enable your talk functionality so you can speak directly to the panelists. So with that, Anton, I'm going to hand over to you to a very exciting topic and session this morning.
Thank you, Vicky, and good morning, everybody. As Vicky said, my name is Anton van Wyk. I chair the Board Governance Forum. I'm also a member of the King Committee, and what's always important, particularly at these events, is to let you know I'm also a Chartered Director. Just a little bit of history before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves. We obviously go through a number of topics, a number of areas of concern for directors when we consider these papers, and thought this was an appropriate paper to start working on about 2 years ago, in the first year of COVID, particularly as we saw board dynamics change. We saw the whole landscape, our business landscape change. And you'll hear that come through both from Zubair's presentation and the questions that we ask a bit later on. But with that, I'd like to introduce the panel to you and by name, and they're going to introduce themselves individually so you can get to hear from them. Claudel, if I can start with you, Dr. Claudel van Eck.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Claudel van Eck. Just in terms of introduction, I'm going to focus particularly to what is relevant to our conversation today. Most people who know me in the context of being the previous CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors, but I'm not an internal auditor. My doctorate is in leadership. I specifically looked at how to lead people through change and uncertainty. I train in culture specifically as well. And for the IOD, sometimes I get called in to train boards on culture. So I thought in terms of introduction, I'll just focus on what would be relevant for our conversation today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Claudel. Taruna Naidu, can you introduce yourself, please?
Morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm Taruna Naidu. I'm a partner at PwC, and I'm also the Chief Ethics Officer for the firm. My work is really focused on developing ethical culture within the organization, and I hope to bring that perspective to you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Taruna. And Shepherd, if you could introduce yourself, Shepherd Shoniwa.
Thank you, Anton. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Shepherd Shoniwa. Like Anton, I'm a chartered director, and I'm also an independent, non-executive chairman in the banking industry, somewhere in the region, not in South Africa, and also in engineering discipline in South Africa. I'm chairman of an engineering consulting company, and I hold other directorships. Over the last 40 years, I've been in business management at general management level, 30 of which I was on boards of both local, continental, and transnational corporations. Culture is something very, very close to my heart, to the extent that some 15 years ago, I wrote a book entitled Cross-Cultural Leadership. And I look forward to sharing my thoughts with you this morning. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shepard. And then finally, Zubair Wadi.
Thanks so much, Anton. Yeah, as Anton said, I'm Zubair. I've seen some of you on some of these IOD panels before. I'm the head of the School of Accountancy at Wits University. And in a previous life, I worked as a partner at PwC. I've been working, interestingly, with the Board Governance Forum and its predecessor at the IOD for more than 10 years. My interest in governance, I think, stems from a lot of what I've seen kind of go wrong at companies, and also what I've seen kind of go right when there's the right governance in place. So yeah, that's me. Welcome to the session.
Thanks, Zubair. So you can see we've got a really good panel set up for you this morning. I think it's going to be an interesting interactive session. And with that, I'll ask that if you do have questions, as Vicky has said, please post them on the Q&A. And we'll be happy to take those questions. We have a 2-hour session, well, 1 hour, 55 minutes left. And before I hand over to Zubair, maybe a little bit of context from my point of view. And I think really we in that era now where each board member should be a carrier and keeper of the company's culture and values. I think the best value a board can add is a consideration of what is going to happen tomorrow. In essence, you need to give sufficient consideration to the future of your organizations that you are overseeing. And I think with that, and I mentioned earlier on, what we are seeing now is effectively, and this is pre-COVID, but certainly during and now post-COVID, just the concept of corporate culture being more than ever a much needed corporate asset for the organization. Now, what we considered as we're going through this paper, and Zubair will give a bit more detail to it, is we looked at how are shared attitudes considered, changes of behaviors, principles, and then obviously values that drive action and purpose within the organization. What we noted in the research leading up to this paper was a lot of organizations were starting to revisit both their explicit and implicit rules. They were assessing, as I said, levels of behavior, interaction within the organization, and how individuals were interacting through the virtual environment and now post that virtual environment, looking at collaboration, how better to collaborate both during the crisis and now after the crisis, as everything is now hopefully subsided. Also, we noted a lot of rebooting of the compliance and ethics policies in organizations. Corporate incentive programs were being revisited, how we were recruiting and training our staff, and those activities regarding the training and recruiting of staff were being amended, they were being updated, with potentially new policies being launched with regard to recruitment and training. Just the whole issue of delegated powers of authority were changing, decision-making processes were being amended, escalation matrices were being developed. There was also a strengthening of communication and information flows. I mean, all of you remember how we all communicated over the past 3 years, and just the extent of that communication. And we were all happy to work sort of 14, 15-hour days, looking at our screens on Zoom, on Google, on Teams. So that whole communication process was changed as well. And I think just finally, the leadership styles we started to see were being amended and changed during and now post-COVID. So taking all those into account, that was the foundation of us deciding on this paper. And I'm going to ask Zubair now to take us through the detail of that paper. And if you haven't got it, you should have received it, but if you haven't received it, Vicky will post it on the chat. So please pick it up off the chat during the course of this presentation. So Zubair, thank you very much, and over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anton. And Vicky, if you could maybe go to the next slide. Anton talked about the fact that we were happy to work 14 and 15 and 16-hour days. I think we just worked 14, 15 and 16-hour days. I'm not sure that we were necessarily happy. The context of this organizational culture and the board paper actually arises, as Anton says, kind of actually even before the start of COVID, and it relates to I guess, a number of issues that we're seeing that we're seeing in the corporate space, where, you know, certainly if you look at policies that companies have in place, if you look at what companies profess to be doing, and compare that to what actually happens within the company, then you start seeing differences. And so the thing that prompted us as the forum to actually say, well, what does organizational culture actually mean? And from an executive and from a board perspective, what are some of the steps that board members, that governing bodies, that executive teams actually need to take into account? We also actually had quite a long discussion around how much do you actually talk about organizational culture. If you look at the literature, there are reams of paper that are written on what exactly organizational culture is, many ideas about how it's measured, etc. And we thought we don't really want to get into all of that detail necessarily for the purpose of this paper. What we're focusing on is really some of the key areas that directors, that executive teams need to think about. We're not doing a deep dive into what is organizational culture, where does it arise, etc. What we've tried to do, though, for those that are, I guess, less initiated, or for the slightly uninitiated, is we've included an appendix at the end of the paper that talks about some of the theoretical or some of the discussions around what makes up organizational culture and what some of the key drivers might be. So that's an appendix to the paper, but the paper really then focuses on, I guess, what we think are, you know, really the crux of the matter. So if you look at the quote that we've got up there, that quote is from Edgar Schein, and he says the only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. If you don't manage culture, culture manages you, and you may not even be aware of the extent to which this is happening. And you link that to some of the other quotes which you see from people like Peter Drucker, etc. They talk about the assessment or the assumption that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And one of the things that you certainly see coming through is this intangible nature of this asset or liability called culture, and how it actually has a pervasive impact across everything that the organization does. So Vicky, if you move to the next slide, you'll see that I've started the slide, and don't worry if you've just joined, the session hasn't ended yet. I've started the session with kind of the slide called the end. And the reason I thought it would be important to start there is because often when we think about culture, we think about it as something which, you know, is sort of there in the background, doesn't necessarily have a massive impact, we think sometimes, on an organization. And I thought if you started with the end in mind, and really two companies that sort of come to mind. The first was Enron and the second Steinhoff. And if you look at Enron, at its peak, was a company that traded at a price per share of $90.75. And just before its bankruptcy in December of 2001, it was trading at 26 cents. So from $90.75 to 26 cents. And you look at that, and that is really the point at which it closed its doors. Steinhoff hasn't yet closed its doors, but it certainly has seen a massive drop in its share price. And one of the things that you've got to then look to is to try to understand, well, why is this? And certainly when you're looking at Enron and you look at a lot of the discussion around Enron, it's certainly a discussion around, well, what was the culture of Enron? And interestingly, when you look at these organizations, and actually when you look at most organizations, the way in which your senior leadership behave and the way in which they act filters then down to all levels within the organization, and in some instances actually filters across to your suppliers and others in your value chain. So Vicky, if we move to the next slide, you'll see that we've broken really the presentation down into 4 key areas. One of the things that you'll see is that I've got questions that will pop up basically about every second slide. What I'm hoping that you guys will do as the slide pops up, I'll give you a minute to think about it, is to type your responses into the chat room or into the chat function as those questions pop up, but I'll certainly give you a prompt for that. So our starting point, we've broken it down into 4 areas. why culture matters, and you'll see, board oversight, and you'll see some of the other areas as we move through. But as a starting point, in terms of why culture matters, we thought we'd start off with the definition. And the definition that we're looking at, excuse me, the definition that we're looking at is the definition that you find in King 4. And that definition in King 4 really talks to, excuse me, the definition in King 4 talks to culture as being the way in which members of an organization relate to each other, their work, and the outside world in comparison to other organizations. And here for me is the key thing. It is generally described as the way we do things around here, even when no one is watching. And I think for me, that is actually the crux of what organizational culture actually is. It's the way we do things around here, even when no one is watching. One of the things that's been very interesting dealing with organizations of late has been this increase in regulation that you're seeing across industries. As if you pick up the Edelman Trust Barometer, for example, you'll see there's certainly a lot less trust in society, organizations, etc. As that trust decreases, you've seen governments try to fill that void by increasing regulation. And a lot of the time, what you're actually seeing from a regulatory perspective is companies saying, how do we make sure that we fulfill and tick these regulatory boxes? And in doing so, they're simply ticking the boxes rather than saying, does this translate into the way in which we actually do business? Or is this something which we just tick off on the side of on a page? The second thing around culture is that even though it's intangible, you can certainly see the effects of it. So I've called it intangible yet visible. Reading through, I guess, a number of books, but certainly if you simply pick up Rob Rose's Steinheist, you'll understand that for many people, that culture was actually visible, even though you couldn't put your finger on it. Sometimes called kind of this uneasy sense that you get in the pit of your stomach. But that's certainly, for those who are watching out, for those who are skeptical and who have almost that auditor skepticism, they're somehow able to identify that intangible yet visible aspect of culture. And lastly, from a why culture matters perspective, it really could either be an asset or liability for you. So for those companies that have a fantastic culture, and you pick up companies, for example, that have an innovative culture, that encourage employees to think outside of the box, etc. You have seen them, and especially in many tech organizations, you've seen them actually able to leapfrog their competitors because of the culture which is built up within the organization. And in that case, it definitely is an asset. On the other hand, you've got many companies, or some companies, for whom the culture actually is a liability. It becomes a culture of, well, what do we do? What can we do actually to, to say that we're complying with these regulations, yet do something which is contrary to them? I'll give you two examples as we go along. So Vicky, if we go to the next slide, you'll see the first question that I'm hoping for a response from all of you in the audience today is, what are the characteristics of a healthy organizational culture? So we'll be talking through that in the next slide. But I'm going to give you kind of just about 20 seconds to simply start typing in your responses. And then Vicky, so just take a second to look at that question. What are the characteristics of a healthy organizational culture? I've deliberately not asked you what is the organizational culture within your organization, because it's not always the easiest question to answer. But I see there's a couple of responses coming in, so we'll take those as we go along. Thank you, Vicky. If you could move to the next slide, we'll see how those responses line up with what we've put down. So when I looked at one of the things that we looked at when you're looking at board oversight was that it certainly is more than a tick box exercise. Now, when we're saying it's more than a tick box exercise, we're not saying that there is no tick box. I think what we're saying is that certainly from a board perspective, the board needs to have a certain number of measures that it uses to identify and understand what the culture within the organization actually is. So absolutely, it's not saying that we simply assess culture based on almost our gut feel. So the things or examples of tools that you might find a board actually using in determining what the culture of the organization are include things, include tools like employee engagement surveys, trust surveys, performance management reports that you might have, incidents of fraud, certainly a lot of what you might see coming through your ethics hotline, whistleblower reports, exit interview reports, all of those form an important component of almost the infrastructure of understanding what the culture within an organization is. However, and I think one of the things that's important, we teach at WITS, we teach a course at the moment on outcomes-based governance as part of one of our other courses. And when we're looking at outcomes-based governance, the thing we're looking to see, which is consistent with King 4, is are you simply ticking the boxes, or do these governance processes actually mean something? So, for example, if you do have exit interview reports, internal audit reports, whistleblower reports, all of those, what is actually done with that information? Is that information kind of put, thematically coded or put into themes, and that information then brought to the board, and something done with that information, or management and something done with that information, or are we simply ticking the boxes? And I think that's one of the things which is quite important. So I've said more than a tick box exercise, implying that, yes, to some degree there is a tick box, but the tick box is not where it ends. Where it ends is what are actually, some of the, what are actually the outcomes of the processes that we've put in place, and how does that actually lead to governance? And that's actually the question which we as a board need to be asking. The next area was around what do we think are the characteristics of a healthy culture? And thank you very much for all of you that have been filling this chat, the chat, webinar chat. I'm not sure what's the right word for you. And if I look at some of the key things which I see coming out in terms of your description of what makes for a healthy culture, Carl Sheikh, for example, looking at yours, good values, transparency, honesty, integrity, leading with principle, I take it. Transparency is certainly one of the key areas. Transparency, and I think linked to that, is actually this concept of, how do we communicate? Certainly, if you look at many organizations that are better from a cultural perspective, they have a lot more open communication channels. And you'll see that we in the paper talk about a lot of what some of the chat participants are talking about. I thought maybe a couple of other interesting ones that I kind of just read out loud that also correlate with what we've got in the paper. Mature and robust engagement, and I think certainly that is one of the areas which is very important. When we look at many of the companies that have failed, what we find is that often a key driver is that you've got management who is kind of quite strong-willed and not necessarily willing to engage in discussion and negotiation. And in the absence of the ability to actually raise your voice, have your voice heard, and to actually take action on that, we find that actually leads to a fair element of, or does not lead to what is considered to be a good culture. I'm not going to go. There are an amazing number of responses here in the chat. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm sure that you'll be able to read them as you go along. I think, Vicky, if we could maybe kind of move on to the next slide. So the next slide is, and we'll deal with it as part of as part of my next slide as well. But the next question for you as a team listening to this is, as a board member, how do you gauge the culture of an organization? So you've given me all of the characteristics that you've thought are actually quite important. And I guess one of the things for me that I'm looking for next is, we've talked, so let's just think about the structure. We've talked about what is culture. We've then said, well, what makes for good culture within the organization? So that's a fairly sort of broad question. Now we're honing it down to saying, as a board member, how do you actually get a feeling for what's happening within the organization? So fastest finger first, as they say, but Vicky, if we could move to the next slide. So when we're looking at evaluating culture, I guess there's a few areas which we need to start thinking about. We're looking at formal policies within the organization. Things like, if I look at, for example, my employer at the moment, things like anti-bullying policies, policies that deal with how co-workers relate to each other, etc. And obviously, very importantly, from a cultural perspective, things like what are the values within the organization? Are those lived values, aspirational values? Are those values which are written down on a piece of paper rather than something which which is actually lived within the organization? But certainly, the formal policies of an organization have to be its starting point. If you read many of the discussions around Enron, for example, you will see that those discussions talk about the fact that Enron had fantastic formal policies in place, right? Fantastic formal policies in place. The question that you had, of course, was, were those policies actually lived? And there, it's in that aspect that we talk about, what are the qualitative aspects that that we need to consider when looking at board culture. So I was just looking to see whether I've got any kind of good responses. And Andile Yankee, absolutely, feedback being one of the critical areas. A clear purpose that is shared and understood by all. I'll tell you an interesting story about an organization that I worked with a couple of years back, and they were kind of in a very regulated space, and the way in which kind of they reported or the way in which they operated was that they had a whole set of formal policies. Those policies were clearly in place. You could find them on the database. Yet, interestingly, when you actually had discussions with staff within the organization, they seemed to be almost completely oblivious of any of these policies which were in place. And so, as it turned out, what happens with those policies is that while those policies existed on the intranet, there was, when somebody joined the team, there was absolutely no discussion around, well, what are the policies and the principles that guide us and that drive this organization? Neither was there any induction that actually helped those employees to understand those policies in place. And so the culture within the organization then completely separated from those policies which were in place. So on paper, these guys could tick off all of the boxes. When you actually had interviews with employees, that's the point at which you realize, that things are starting to, potentially unravel here. Some of the qualitative characteristics that we've thought about, I'll just mention kind of two of them. Is, I think, firstly, an end justifies the means approach to performance, which says, let's do what we need to in order to maintain that profit. Again, one of the books that I've been reading recently has been Steinhaus. I'm not punting the book. It's certainly just something that I'm reading at the moment. And in that, the author Rob Rose talks about how eerily accurate some of Steinhoff's forecasts used to be. So whatever, and talks about sort of doing whatever it meant in order to obtain those performance targets. I saw, Susan, you talk very interestingly in the chat around how do executive directors act when things go wrong. And certainly that's one of the areas that we've focused on. Some of the, I'm just going to talk about two more from sort of our list, and linked to yours, Susan, was, we say problems being concealed and bad news hidden. Something called a good news culture. Is it that you only ever hear good news about the company, never any bad news to be heard? Certainly one of the warning signs of qualitative aspects that you need to think about. One of the other ones that we've got, the last one I'll talk about, you can read the rest in the paper, is around lower level staff being blamed when things go wrong, and the lack of accountability by management or those or those actually in charge. So I'm just going to have a quick look at, I realize I'm running very quickly out of time. Just have a very quick look at some of your responses. How do executive directors act when things go wrong? Jeremy, you're talking about leadership style in shaping the culture of an organization. Absolutely. You'll see in the paper, in the appendix, we talk about the different leadership styles and also actually the different stages of maturity that organizations might actually go through, and how that potentially impacts the culture of the organization. Mudzunga, I thought you had a very interesting comment, and then I know there's a lot more interesting ones, but I am going to move on. Mudzunga, you talked about external perception, example from customers, media coverage, etc. Certainly, one of the things that you're starting to see is a lot more or people who are analyzing companies, no longer almost just taking the party line or taking the company line. Certainly, I've seen in the US and in some other countries, you've got organizations that kind of almost scrape the web to find what is being said about the organization on social media, so that you can start having kind of a little, almost a triangulation or a correlation between what the company says internally and what it puts out as its communications versus what's actually being said in the public. So certainly that I think is starting to become an important way in which companies can start thinking about measuring culture. And lastly, the role of remuneration. And there we're talking about what is the way in which management is incentivized to perform its functions, and do those KPIs which management are remunerated on, do they actually enhance or lead to a better culture within the organization, or do they lead to actually a culture that says, let's act in a way that is not befitting for this organization? Vicky, if we could move on to the next slide, please. My last question for today, and thank you all for the amazing responses that you've provided in the chat. Last question is, what are the ingredients of poor boardroom culture? So what are the ingredients of poor boardroom culture? And Vicky, if you could move on to the next slide for me, please. And when we're looking at boardroom culture, then I guess we're looking at, first of all, what is the role of the chair? When we look at the role of the chair, certainly in many of the other discussions that we've been having in the space, we've talked about, well, what do you do when you've got almost an overpowering CEO or an overpowering chair, etc., or overpowering members of the board who are kind of very vocal, don't allow others to get, to get their voice in. And we said the role of the chair actually is critical and crucial. The role of the chair really in moderating those discussions, in bringing forward those unheard voices, in making sure that a culture of bullying, for example, does not exist on the board. So really the role of the chair in sort of making sure that the board functions as it should, and that actually each of the directors has an appropriate chance to sort of tell his or her story. The attributes of board members that you're looking for are really board members who are, who are willing to speak their mind. If you look at one of the papers that we've recently sort of just refreshed, it's the paper on dissenting directors. We're talking about the fact that it's important for directors actually to feel empowered to say what it is that they feel. Also important from a business judgment rule perspective is that the director is actually appropriately, obviously, prepared himself, him or herself, and then actually voices that opinion in terms of what they think is the best approach for the company, for the company going forward. So the attributes of the board members that you're looking for are people who are willing to speak their mind, yet people who are individuals who are able to listen to others, to understand their perspective and their point of view, and use other perspectives and other points of view to actually come to what is inevitably a better decision. We've talked about the role of remuneration. I'm not going to focus on it again for this part of the session. And I think the last area that we've then got is, some of the questions for boards, but maybe questions for boards to actually be board members and boards to actually be thinking about as they work through, as they think about board culture. But I just want to quickly step into the chat to see what it is that you guys are saying. And I think a lot of that actually aligns to what we're seeing. Jenny, I'm seeing you saying that there's limited understanding of the role of the board members and a lack of courage. Absolutely. I think that is one of the, I'm not saying that happens in all boards, obviously, but where you look at boards that are, boards that are not as effective as they should be, there is a kind of often a limited understanding and a lack of wanting to actually raise their views. Fifika, I'm not sure if that's your full name. I just see a small kind of portion of your name there. Intolerance of different views. And I think one of the key things from a board perspective certainly is in allowing those different views actually to get airtime, and then allowing those views to, allowing oneself to say, well, is that view potentially kind of a better view than where I initially settled? That is really the point of the board discussion, to obtain these different views and to get to what is effectively, collectively, the best view for the organization. Douglas, you're talking about not owning decisions made by the board as a whole, even if one was a dissenting voice. I think quite an important point there as well. Carl, you're talking about poor leadership from the chair. Osman, you're talking about, do directors fully understand their role as board members? Losing independence, rubber stamping, James, inability to handle conflicts of interest effectively. I think those are all kind of absolutely areas which boards need to focus on. Rubber stamping, I think, James, is quite an important one. You know, it really comes down to when you listen to kind of some of the better chairs of boards, you know, they're willing to engage with board members and say, what is it that drives you to agree with or disagree with this decision? You know, have you actually applied your mind to this situation? So I'm not going to go more into questions for boards. I think that kind of what you guys have put in the chat is pretty good. And you'll see there's a few more areas that we talk about in our paper. Vicky, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Next slide, really the official end, as opposed to kind of the end that you saw right at the beginning. And I think what the key takeaways for us in drafting the paper, because we've certainly learned a lot going through the process of actually drafting the paper. Key takeaways for us is that you know, the culture of the organization is absolutely inseparable from the purpose, the values, the strategy, and the leadership of the organization. Culture is such an important component, yet one which is often neglected because it's not visible at the surface. In order to be able to get to the crux of culture, you really need to take a step back, apply your mind, and almost look for what it is that you're not seeing, and then apply your mind to say, well, what am I not seeing? What is the culture of the organization? How do I actually apply my mind, and how do I engage with others within the organization to understand what is the appropriate culture? Then you're asking, as a board member, you're asking yourself questions around what steps has the company actually put in place to ensure that they've got the right culture that they're hoping to achieve. And certainly I think as kind of the board governance forum, our key takeaway was if you're missing the culture, well, key takeaway actually directly aligns with what Peter Drucker said, and that's probably a good way to end it, is that at the end of the day, culture is strategy for breakfast. If you've not focused on your board culture, there's certainly a big board and organizational culture. There's potentially a big gap within your organization, and that opens a big risk for you. On the other hand, if your culture is you know, constantly developing and moving in the right direction, certainly an opportunity to have a fantastic asset that serves you as board members and the organization well into the long run. That's it from me. I think I've overrun my time by a few minutes. Apologies for that, Vicky. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Zubair, very much. I think that's laid the foundation for this morning's session very well. So appreciate your comments and all the effort you put into actually helping us pull that paper together. What I'd like to do now is move on to the panelists and get them to answer some questions, both from yourselves. So please don't forget, post those questions in the Q&A, and I'll pick them up as we go along. But before we do that, I think just related to what Zubair has presented this morning, I'd like to just ask one or two of the panelists a few questions to kind of unpack some of the detail that was in the presentation. Obviously, it is in the paper. And Claudel, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. You heard from Zubair on some of the areas where, you know, as directors we should be aware of as to where potentially there could be issues around culture. But what, in your opinion and in your view, are some of the common culture pitfalls that boards should be aware of as we kind of proceed into the future?
Thank you, Anton. And once again, good morning, everybody. Let me firstly say that I think that is so important for the IOD to have put this paper out. And I think that I really want to encourage the audience to read this paper in conjunction with the governance of ethics paper. The paper does make reference to that governance of ethics paper, but I know that we also had a panel discussion very similar to this one, when that paper was launched. So go and have a look at that recording as well if you didn't have the opportunity to participate in that. It's really important to look at the two together. And so some of the common mistakes or pitfalls, to answer your question, Anton, let me start with saying that I think that too many boards tend to think about culture in a linear, one-dimensional way. Culture is a lot more messy than saying, here are our policies, here are here's the code of ethics or code of conduct, and that is enough. And we've set the tone at the top, and that essentially is the culture, right? But cultures in organizations really are ecosystems with multiple dimensions. So when you're looking at culture, you really ideally want to look at culture through different lenses. You need to have an understanding as a board of what is the dominant culture, what are the subcultures, because you do have a dominant culture and you have subcultures in your organization, right? If you think about it in a one-dimensional way, you are going to miss very important aspects of the culture. The other aspect that I think is really, really important is, and Zubair touched on that and it's touched on in the paper, is when the board doesn't really reflect on its own culture and how its culture affects the executive layer and the rest of the organization. Like, as I said earlier on, you've got to think about culture in multiple dimensions. So you've got a culture at the board, you've got a culture at executive level, and you've got cultures, your subcultures within the organization. And there's this ripple effect that happens within the organization. But when a board doesn't have collective self-awareness, and it doesn't spend enough time to think deeply about the issues around culture, but in particular how their actions affect the organization, how their decisions affect the organization, and how it ripples, then you're going to have a disconnect. So often what you find, and we've seen this through various studies, that there is often a disconnect between what the top thinks is happening in the organization and what the bottom knows what is happening in the organization. And how do you close that loop is a very important part of the conversation that the board needs to have. What are our feedback loops? So one of the things that's mentioned in the paper, for example, is your culture surveys. But here I want to really caution, because I think this is one of the areas where we can very, very easily make mistakes or step into a pitfall. And that is we outsource the process of evaluating the culture. Maybe people answer questionnaires, but those questionnaires, we often don't even look at them ourselves to ask ourselves the question, are we asking A, the right questions, and B, how the questions are framed? Are we pulling through what it is that we really need to surface within the organization? I've seen so many of these different questionnaires, and sometimes when you look at the questionnaire, you're like, wow, this looks like a cut and paste story where people have just gone and pulled questions from the internet, but there hasn't been a real application of mind. And if that is then not followed by qualitative, in other words, having conversations with people. Remember, when people answer questions in a questionnaire, they answer the questions with a particular frame of mind. And if one doesn't have a conversation where you can dig deeper to have a real understanding of what exactly is it that the person was thinking, what the person is seeing, you're also only going to get to the surface. The other thing is where I think when we need to also apply a little more, we have a more application of mind, is what we see as essentially signs of a healthy culture, right? So I've seen some of your responses, the question around what do we think is a healthy culture. Here, two things. The one is that healthy is often in the eye of the beholder. And where we can often make a mistake as boards is to go into groupthink or an echo chamber And this often happens when we don't have enough diversity. And diversity is not just about how people look around the table, but real diversity in terms of the way we think and what we bring to the table. And we can have a particular picture in mind of what a good culture looks like, but it is completely disconnected to what others may think, and those people in the organization or even our stakeholders may think what a good culture should look like. So we've got to be very, very mindful that we don't fall into groupthink. We also need to be very careful in terms of what it is that we celebrate. So for example, our attrition rate is low. And we say, yes, that is a sign of a healthy culture, but it isn't necessarily. It may just be that your people don't have other options. The fact that people stay because they don't have other options does not mean that they're staying because the culture of the organization is healthy. The same goes for remuneration, right? So often what we tend to do with remuneration is we do benchmarking with the market, but the reality is the market is not always right. So your culture is an ecosystem that lives within a broader ecosystem, and that is society. Right? So for example, if we look at the South African society, what we have seen over time with the market is done is to increase inequality. And if we just become market takers, in other words, we don't apply our minds, we just benchmark and we say, yeah, no, we're looking good in relation to others in the industry, but we don't really think about what does it mean and what is it driving within the organization. That becomes problematic. Also, another aspect where we can make real mistakes is not understanding the phase the organization is in and how it affects the culture. So if the organizations are going through crisis, what does that mean? If there's lots of trauma in the organization, what does it mean for the culture? We've just seen quite a bit of that as we've come through the pandemic. Maybe just one or two more. I'm just picking what I think maybe some of the things that is important where boards make mistakes. There, of course, a whole list of them that one can go through. But just one that I think that is often lacking is not having a behavioral specialist in the skills mix. You know, so when we look at the skills around at the table in the boardroom, more often than not, we find that one skill set that is missing is behavioral specialist. And your behavioral specialist essentially helps the board to start to look through those different lenses and not just have a very surface conversation around the culture within the organization. And maybe just lastly, I'd say one of the things that I often see us do is not including the culture of the board in evaluating the culture of the organization. So we almost look at the board, we talk about the board's culture, but we separate the board from the overall organizational culture when we evaluate the culture of the board. So you've got to think about whether your process of evaluating the culture includes looking at the board's culture and how the board's culture is impacting on the organization. And maybe I just lastly would say that I think many of us in the room may have find ourselves in a challenging position where we may understand what needs to happen within the organization in terms of having the discussions around culture and bringing the culture conversation squarely onto the agenda of the board. But if you're sitting with board members who don't see the value in it, I mean, we've got the same problem with ethics, right? So these two kind of work hand in hand, where people don't see it as an issue that needs to be discussed. We take it for granted. This actually is a really good opportunity for you to take the paper and use the paper as a conversation starter and start to think about some of those things that you can start to bring to the table in terms of, you know, looking at mistakes that other organizations have made. And more often than not, when people start to see the risk materializing in other areas, they start to reflect a little more. And hopefully that will help you. Thank you, Anton.
Thanks so much, Claudel. Maybe while we've got your attention, if you could very briefly, you spoke about discussions, behavioral issues, a behavioral specialist, maybe linking the culture of the organization with the board. If I look at Terry Solomon's question here, she says that King 4 expounds that the board must be diversified with respect to a number of issues, skills, gender, ethnicity, etc. And with this comes diverse cultural differences. And how do you align these differences to arrive at one culture for the business?
That's a really great question. And it's one of those things that that's really difficult as well, right? So I think firstly, as South Africans, we need to tap into a skill that we've learned over time, and that is our ability to work with diversity because we've been forced to do so. But it is about being able to sit together and having open, honest conversations with each other. And Zabir did mention earlier on the role of the chair, very, very important here. It is about maturity. So if you don't have a board that is mature and a good chair, you got a little bit of a problem. And here I would then advise board members who are sitting in a context like that to start to think a little more strategically around how do we bring those conversations into a space where they are constructive. This is now where you're dealing with human beings. Right? So human beings, because we're social beings, we tend to more often than not go into our limbic system. So limbic system essentially is our emotion center sits there. Instead of thinking with our prefrontal cortex, which is where your executive function sits and your problem solving sits. And once we're in the limbic system, we start to then go from an emotional space. Right? And most of us are, even if we don't realize it at a subconscious level, are very invested in our own cultures. And we can take it very, very personally when somebody says to us, there's something wrong in your culture. But it takes a mature individual to be able to step back and say, yeah, actually that stuff that my ancestor taught me is not going to work in this setting. But this is really where it is important for boards to be able to have those very, very open conversations. But if you go into the conversation with the mindset of, I am here to protect my culture, then we're going to have a serious problem.
Thanks, Claudel. Zubair, you have your hand up. Do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Anton. I think absolutely spot on in terms of what Claudel's talked about. And one of the things that we were exploring as part of actually writing the paper was actually these kind of these biases which we all hold, right? And so we don't actually, there's often things which we take as kind of completely acceptable, take for granted, and yet to other people, I think as Claudel has explained, completely unacceptable, makes absolutely kind of no sense. One of the things, three quick, in response to Terry's sort of question, I think I had kind of three quick thoughts. The first was you actually need something to pull the board together. So you need a shared set of values and a purpose that actually pulls everybody in the same direction. So almost a central theme to bring everybody onto the same page. Once everybody knows where they're going, makes it a lot easier to say, is this decision which we're about to make, is that congruent with our shared set of values and our purposes in organization? And I think that's why you're actually seeing a lot more organizations start to bring purpose and values, into the way in which they talk about themselves. So I think that's the starting point. The other two areas I thought were very interesting in some of the discussions that we were having. I think the first was around these blind spots, and the second was around listening. And those are, again, kind of soft and almost in some ways intangible skills. They're not, can you operate Excel? Have you done a business management course, etc. Yet in many instances, boards actually require training on some of these softer areas around how do you actually listen with the aim of kind of taking information in rather than with the aim of responding. So listen for information rather than listening for responding. And then secondly, around how do we actually deal with our cultural biases? And often some training is required just to kind of make one aware of those cultural biases. Without saying much more, those were some of the key points for me, Anton. Thanks.
And it's really important, sorry, Anton, if I may just add this. One of the things that I see this in my coaching practice a lot, where we find it difficult as human beings to get to a point where we realize that actually our self-awareness is very low, right? So we know from the field of neuroscience that we're only consciously aware of about 10 to 12% of what's really going on in our minds. The rest is sitting in our subconscious mind. And if you start there with, I actually don't know myself as well as I think I do, then it forces you into a situation where you can start to think more clearly through, okay, so if I only know so much, how do I then counter that? And that self-discovery is part of the process of listening to others. But when you're in a space of, I know myself and I know what my thought processes are, then you become, those blind spots become much more difficult for us to see. So self-awareness as a collective, as the board, is important, but self-awareness at the level of the individual is something that we really struggle with at leadership level, because sometimes when people in leadership positions, they think they've kind of arrived and they're very mature.
Great insights. Thank you very much, both of you. And Claudel, especially all your comments, very valid. Interesting to see on the chat, you know, as you're talking, and I would recommend everyone just to keep an eye on that chat. I know they're coming up on your screen, but there's some great points that are coming out on the chat. And I don't know, Vicky, if you and your team are able to kind of condense those and keep them. That links a lot to what we've already heard this morning, both from Zubair and now from Claudel. Just going to move on slightly, and this particular question deals with two areas, and also covers off on two of the questions that have been posted. And Shepard, this is going to be to you, if you don't mind. You know, you and I spoke a lot while we were putting this paper together around, you know, how is culture influenced by our communities, the communities that surround our organizations where we operate? How is culture influenced by societal demographics? And we had a great discussion on those particular points and tried to capture that as best we could in the paper. But I also, before you start, Shepard, I also want to refer you to two questions, one from Ilse Morgan. I'm going to read it out as well, and it links to this particular discussion point, is how will we address the gap in terms of accountability between the public and private sector? There's a lack of transparency, as becomes evident from Zondo. The public sector is not acting on its own. So if you can also consider that, please, Shepard, in your answer. And then Douglas Ross also then talks, which is a very relevant question in our environment. And we spoke about the sort of societal demographics that we have in our country. His question relates to the culture of South Africa as a whole, SA Inc. We as South Africans spend a lot of time moaning. Sometimes we have good right to moan when the lights go out about SA. However, we too contribute to the overall culture in the country through our own behavior, what we accept and what we don't accept. And are there lessons from this paper which can be utilized in turning around SA Inc.? So Shepard, we're not suggesting that you're going to save us from all of our woes, but if you wouldn't mind dealing with both those questions and the kind of the societal demographic question as well.
Indeed. Thanks, Anton. I will start with the demographics question and then move on to the other two. Yes, culture is the stamp of leaders of the day.
Shepard, can I ask if you're able to, would you put your camera on?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I had forgotten to do that. As Zubair spelled it out quite clearly, that culture is in fact evolving. It's not static at all. You know, because organizations are living organisms, and there's the whole question when you go deeply into the paper, that culture is in fact it involves in unison with the major events that do take place in society around it. You know, such as COVID, which you, Anton, referred to when you're talking about the change of various cultures that came about because of the black swan of COVID. So society indeed does influence culture, both at individual and at macro level. Let's flash back to apartheid days. The organizational culture was mainly driven by the leaders of the day, who were all white and in most cases Afrikaner, and therefore the culture of the day, organizational culture, was very steeped towards a minority group and not as inclusive as we would find today. And you look at African culture, when you go right back in history, before everybody could read and write, African culture was all handed down through storytelling. So that is a very clear example of how society and the community, in fact, hands down culture from one generation to the next. And therefore, the regions, the regional and ethnical aspects and tribal aspects, especially within the African context, they actually influence the culture of the individual, which in turn influence their contribution to the culture of the organization. So that's, in the limited time, that's what I would say about the first question. Then coming to Ilse's question, how to address the culture gap between private and public sector. I have, in fact, like her, I followed Zondo Commission very, very much. And I had all those questions coming up to say, as a leader, how can I contribute to resolving this conundrum between the public and... Now, public sector is influenced mainly by one shareholder, and that one shareholder is the government of the day. They have a shareholder representative who runs, in this case, all the parastatals, and as in our case, is the Minister of Public Enterprises. So, which means it is the culture of the government of the day that, in fact, influences the state of the culture of parastatals. And how do they do that? They appoint the boards of their choice. So that's why you find Zondo Commission recommended that, in fact, there be an independent organization that appoints directors of parastatals in an objective manner. Of course, government hasn't taken this up, and I think this is why Chief Justice Zondo was complaining about Parliament not doing anything about the report 2 weeks ago, and he was taken to task. But that's exactly it, because going back to the essence of the paper, it is the board that is, in fact, the main crafter of culture, organizational culture. And in this case, when the board is appointed by government, and therefore it crafts culture that is also supportive of who their handler is. Now, private sector, as we know, yes, all of our directors are hopefully appointed in an objective manner, and we end up with a very good melting pot of multi-cultural boards, as all the various codes of corporate governments do indicate to us. Now, how do we marry the two? How can we close the gap? How we close the gap is, apart from just praying that the government will hear our prayers, we should, in fact, put ourselves in a position where, if you are able to join a parastatal board, please do. I know it's extremely a thankless job, but when you are given the opportunity, do so. And yes, it will be like dropping water on stone, but at some stage it might dissolve. So one has to keep on, or the more of us that can get into parastatals, the better. That's one way, which is not as easy to do. The more easier ways are to put up opinion papers. We find our CEO at IODSA is very good at this, putting up papers Yesterday, she had one about Transnet, putting up opinion papers that expose the shortcomings in parastatal boards, and B, contribute to the debate on how those shortcomings can be eliminated. So those are, I think, the two very practical ways. The third one is those who have influence or have the ear of decision makers who influence parastatals. They should do that, and a lot of business leaders do have that. We have business organizations, Business Unity South Africa, Business for South Africa, Business Leadership South Africa. All those I know, the Mining Council, they play a big role in all the time in trying to influence government as much as they can. And we should always make sure that we stop the fires with the representatives in those organizations to ensure that they preach the right gospel whenever they have the ear of the ministers, the ear of parastatal chairmen, parastatal board chairmen, and parastatal board members themselves. So I think in the limited time, I will also stop that one and then come to Douglas' question on SA Inc. SA Inc., it flashes back very much to the first question when I was answering about how demographics influence culture. And indeed, SA Inc. is we have 11 different languages, now 12 with sign language. And that on its own means, in fact, we have 11 cultures. And those 11 cultures, they are equal in status. And how do we then boil them down, meld them, and create a good, balanced culture, right? As Claudel talked about self-awareness earlier on, which in fact contributes a great deal to the solution here. Each one of those various cultures should be self-aware of what is it that is good for the public good from their culture, and they can contribute it. What is it that in fact will retard the public good, and therefore they should underplay it? That is the whole essence of cross-cultural leadership, to ensure that you extract the best out of each culture and put them in one melting pot and create a hybrid culture that then is understood by everybody who is at play, and everybody supports it. And it will hopefully create the right climate for the organization and for the nation, in this case, talking about SA Inc. I'll stop there, Anton.
Shepard, thank you very much. While we've got you've got our attention, I should say, I'm going to ask you one more question from Nanda Govender, and it kind of links into what you've been talking about as well. And Nanda says, I'm with an SOC that has had numerous changes at boards, CEOs, and executive level over the past 15 years. I realize that the top will continue to change, and it's up to senior and middle management to drive and maintain culture, or the culture of the organization. But most are not skilled or equipped to do so. What are your thoughts on changes at the top versus other levels of the organization?
Right. Change at the top does affect the organization a lot more than change anywhere at lower levels. Why? It's because the top runs the organization. It creates the culture. So in this case, yes, it's almost unavoidable that the changes are taking a place at the top, because it's an SOE. Going back to the earlier debate, that obviously the shareholder representative makes these changes become so rapid, which is very unfortunate. Now, there is a mention of skills gap. What then should happen, probably to stop the hemorrhage, is the board, there's hardly anything that senior management can do or the executive team can do about stopping the board churn. But what they can do is to ensure that there is a very good recruitment pragmatic recruitment of the appropriate skills into higher levels of management. And because that is within their control, and ensure that there is sufficient succession planning and development of those in the middle levels to ensure that should a gap again occur at executive level, there is somebody who is in place to step into that position, who has A, the history and culture of the organization at their fingertips, and B, the right skills to do so. So the focus by management in this case should be to strengthen their own bench in terms of skills, and also to elaborate their own culture and make sure this culture becomes impenetrable. The board, then they come into the unique position where they will have to educate each new board and embed the new culture into each new board, which can be a very good position to be in as management if the board is one that is tenable and can listen. Then because the board changes so much that they can't expect the trickle down from the board on creating the culture. So they would better strengthen the culture themselves and then teach it upstairs to each new board that comes. I'll stop there.
Yep, no, that's great. Thanks, Shep. And I suppose it links as well to what Claudel said about behavioral specialists understanding the behavior of senior manager, middle management, and how that link to the board is made a little more sound. So thank you very much for your answers. Taruna, we haven't forgotten about you. What I'd like to ask you, and I'm going to link, once you've answered the question, I'm going to link it to another question that's been posted on the Q&A. But you know, with your role, and obviously in an organization like PwC and the size of the organization, plus your link as well to a range of clients, and your particular role with regard to the ethics within the organization, I just wondered, from your perspective, you know, how has culture shifted post-pandemic? Maybe take us through the pandemic and then post-pandemic, and then also how the link between culture and the quality of reporting has changed. Has it improved, or has it got a little worse? So appreciate your comment on that.
Thanks, Anton. So I think firstly, just reflecting on the paper, you know, I think it was very encouraging to see an increased focus on the role of culture and the ability, or the impact that has on the ability of the board to execute on their strategy. You know, culture really does determine the tone that permeates throughout the organization, and, you know, making sure that your middle management, your lower staff are actually aligned in terms of what they need to execute on and how they need to interact. You know, it's quite critical to make sure that you don't get divergence in terms of expectation versus, you know, behavior and action on the ground. So if we think post-pandemic, I think there have been so many workforce surveys that have been done, you know, to reflect on what this changing workforce looks like, what does the new world of work, you know, really feel like on the ground. And some of the themes that have come out of some of those surveys include topics like, you know, we're in the age of reskilling and continuous reinvention. And I think Zubair alluded to it in his presentation as well, where he talked about an innovation culture. So, you know, clearly work environments are changing. The pace of that change is quite significant, and we need individuals within organizations who are able to effectively challenge the status quo and also to reinvent themselves, you know, at quite a rapid pace. Now, an organization is only going to be able to achieve that if the workforce goes along with them in terms of that ambition and that mindset. And I think what's a little concerning from some of these workforce surveys that we see, you know, very small percentages of organizations actually tolerate small scale failure within the organization. So that culture of trying, you know, failing, sort of trying again, that real innovative culture is not something that's well adopted, you know, at present. And if we really need to move towards a different way of operating, you know, we're going to have to reflect on how do we create an opportunity for people to experiment, to debate, to disagree with the status quo, and you know, have an environment in which they can actually raise some of the new ideas and fresh thinking. And Anton, I think aligned to disruption, we've also seen, disruption on steroids, right? From a digital perspective, Gen AI has come in and is really shifting the way in which many jobs are being performed today. We've got other types of technology that we need to grapple with and understand, how do we bring kind of the human element into what we focus on and what we deliver. That has an impact on supply chains and, all the way down the chain in terms of how an organization operates. But, my question, I suppose, is whether boards have really considered the impact of these significant changes on their culture, and are we adapting quickly enough, in terms of our strategy to keep pace? Because the challenge that we have is that culture often takes a very long time to change. And we don't have the luxury of that time if we look at the pace of change, in the environment. I think some of the other themes that we see coming through is clearly a focus around well-being, mental well-being, depression, anxiety, etc. If I just shift it to an ethical culture perspective, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of ethical issues that are being raised by individuals being underpinned by a mental well-being issue or a depression or an anxiety issue. So again, the question is, do we really understand the risks that this sort of shift has created, and do we have the support structures, mechanisms in place to support those individuals who are struggling, in a very proactive way? I think we also talked about a sort of a disconnect between, what the board understands, what senior executives understand around the culture of an organization, and what the employee really understands. And we made reference to surveys that can be conducted and focus group discussions to really dig into the detail. And I'm fully supportive of that. I mean, what I would just offer in that space is to think around whether, we've really done a proper root cause analysis around the outcomes of those surveys. So, we talk about the 5 whys. Do we keep asking why until we really understand what is driving this particular behavior? And I think in many of the examples that I've seen, the cause is always human behavior. It's not around a system that doesn't work or a system that's ineffective. It's around people, and how they effectively choose to behave that actually drives some of this challenge. I think, another reflection point, if I just think around, the current environment that we're operating in, and the work that I'm trying to focus on in terms of building an ethical culture, one of the sort of key foundations that you do require or that contributes towards an ethical culture is a stable business environment. And what we're seeing, at present is that we've got rising cost of living. We've got employees who are really challenged in terms of, their buying power, hybrid ways of working, opportunities, etc. All of this does create a challenge in terms of stability and drives people's behavior, perhaps in an unhealthy sort of way. So, that externality really means that as boards, we need to focus on, what is that positive culture that we need to build? Do we have the right measures in place to address some of these practical challenges that our employees are experiencing, at present? And then I suppose the last point in terms of sort of significant change, and it has been alluded to as well, around the purpose of an organization and its values. Many employees currently, they expect the organization that they are working for to positively contribute to society. So they are expecting responsibility, care for communities, customers, the environment, etc. And many organizations are facing questions from their employees around how they're meeting, society's needs. What is their societal purpose? What are the efforts around climate? And we are seeing more and more that, employees will not stay with an organization or join an organization unless they have a sense that their personal values do actually align to the organization's values. So, consistently we're hearing the message that it's not enough to be neutral any longer, around some of these topical areas, and employees really expect individuals, boards and companies to have a point of view, around some of these topical areas. So that's what I'd say on, where we're seeing the shift, and on, post the pandemic. If we think about reporting, I mean, reporting really has a transformative capability, right? So what gets measured is really what people focus on and what effectively gets done. In the past, if we look at external reporting, very financially focused, which drove a lot of the activity of the organization. What you get measured on obviously is where your focus area is. And as companies start to shift more towards sort of sustainability reporting, more integrated type of reporting, it's an opportunity for an organization to reflect on the value that they are creating, right? Both outside the organization and for the employees as well. So we do see a shift in terms of, hopefully away from that tick box approach that we referenced earlier, to real reflection around the impact that they are having and the outcome of sort of their activity. Culture and integrity, they are strongly linked. So integrity in decision making and integrity in the transparency of your reporting is quite critical in terms of, your message out into the market and what that means for the reputation of your organization. So when it comes to culture and being transparent, I think it is important for organizations to also think about the targets that they set around some of these activities. So what are your culture targets? And how robust is your reporting in terms of you reflecting on whether you've met that target or not? We talk about greenwashing. I think we're all familiar with the concept. Do we have culture washing in terms of the stories that we're telling and the messages that we're putting out? Are we really reflecting on the integrity that we need to act with in terms of our reporting and decision making? So I'll stop there, Anton. Thank you.
Thanks, Taruna. I said I'd ask you an additional question. And this is from Dashni Vilakazi, who asks, please guide on how an organization can still maintain a good or brilliant culture whilst we're going through this hybrid working model. What is your experience in that?
Yeah, so, we found that the hybrid working environment does create some challenge in terms of connecting with employees, and we need to look at new mechanisms to do that. So, the communication, the consistency of that communication, ensuring that we're setting the right tone from the top is quite critical in terms of, ensuring that we've got this connectivity and clarity in terms of how we expect our people to behave. Do they have a clear understanding of our strategy? Are there enough touch points in terms of their connectivity to the organization? What we've also seen from a practical perspective, and we spoke about it before, surveys are important. They don't have to be long, lengthy. They can be pulse surveys, quick conversations. If we look at individuals who have the responsibility for managing teams, are they taking the time to actually connect with those teams on a consistent basis and have conversations outside the work conversation, right? So are there conversations happening around well-being, their feeling towards the organization, the support that the individual needs in order to remain connected and remain a sort of positive contributor towards the strategy. So I think from a practical perspective, that's what we've seen. If I focus a little bit on the ethics side as well, the virtual environment does unfortunately create an environment where people can misconstrue, tone, messaging, expectations from their leadership. So what is important is that when things go wrong and people raise concerns, that you also have the right mechanisms in place to deal with those incidents. So, if you look at things like your ethics hotline and your other reporting mechanisms, are you dealing with those issues, quickly, effectively? Are you giving feedback to the individual and trying to resolve the issue as quickly as possible so that it doesn't escalate in terms of the person's perception of the impact that that's having on their work environment?
Great, thank you. And I suppose linked to that as well, and I saw a question earlier on this point, I see it's disappeared, but is as we go through this concept of understanding roles and responsibilities, and does the hybrid model work with regard to culture? It's the old adage of directors putting their nose in but keeping their fingers out. And the role of the executive committee is effectively risk-taking, value creation. The role of the board is to oversee change to ensure stability. And I think if we get those concepts and get to understand those concepts and then figure out how these hybrid models would work, I think it makes life a little easier. So thanks Taruna for that. I'm going to move now, Zubair. I'm going to ask you to answer this question. Morning, Joe. Good to connect again. As you say, I mean, this topic, or the culture topic, is relevant and is critical. And you're concerned about getting the right people in the boardroom that understand culture. And you want to know, how could we, and I assume when you say we, is this collective, potentially the BGF or the IOD, influence the SA board appointment process to help us get the right board culture? Have you any views on that, Zubair, for Joe?
Thanks, Anton. I think quite a topical one, and one that you, I guess, seeing open up a lot more, in the public domain. One of the key questions that you're seeing people start to ask is, for example, should there be forced appointments onto boards? I think my own view on it is I would be hesitant to follow that as as an approach. I think we kind of, in the system that we currently operate in, we're saying that you really want effectively the shareholders to appoint the directors onto the company, or onto the board of the shareholders of the company to appoint the directors onto the governing body, onto the board. One of the things that I think we can do a lot better, and maybe it's to answer a question, I think both that Joe, as well as I think there was one other question that was asking, was around, well, what are the characteristics that we should be looking at in our directors? I think that's actually the critical thing. So for me, it's about saying, what are the key characteristics of directors? What due diligence do we do on these directors to ensure that they're fit for purpose, that they bring the right levels of skill, diversity, etc., to the board? There's often an accusation that the kind of boards are really, especially South African boards, are really sort of an all boys club. I think there's a lot more sort of focus these days on ensuring that additional sort of diversity coming into the boardroom. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, absolutely. But I think as a starting point, if you were kind of an aspirant director, I think you'd be looking to kind of get that chartered director designation, looking to build up your networks and really build up your skills profile and base, and then sort of really be applying for those positions. I think those are the keys. I'm not sure if Joe's question directly alludes to it. Maybe it's just kind of, again, my subconscious throwing stuff that's not in the question into the question, but it's really a question of, I'm certainly not in favor of kind of enforcing or having external bodies appoint members onto the board. I think it comes down to kind of building up the right skills and building up the integrity and kind of the view of the board to make sure that we've got the right people in that space.
Maybe while we got you, your attention as well, and I think this is slightly linked to this question. There's one from Osman Ibrahim. He says, should the barriers to entry for board members be reviewed? And I assume you have barriers to entry, meaning do we broaden representation to ensure that we create the right kind of culture at a board level?
Thanks, Anton. And I think maybe that's when I was kind of responding, those are probably the two. I had those two sort of questions in mind. But I think when we're looking at sort of broadening those boundaries, I think we absolutely should. We should have a look at, do we have the right level of diversity on the board? And that diversity is not just, I think often when we're thinking about diversity, we're thinking about kind of either kind of gender diversity or racial diversity. I think actually we're talking about diversity of experience, skills, all of those things kind of fitting into that bucket of diversity. When we're looking at the barriers to entry, I think there's maybe the starting point really for that question is, what do we understand as the perceived barriers to entry? And if they, I'm not sure that I necessarily see those perceived barriers to entry. So yeah, maybe if we had a little bit more guidance from, I think it was Osman, in terms of what he thinks the barriers to entry might be able to better answer that. But I think the first explanation or first answer that I gave, I'm hoping kind of addressed his question as well.
And I suppose that links as well, Zubair, to the barriers of exit. So if you are accountable as a board member, and if you get up to mischief, or you're dissenting in a particular way that is not appropriate, or you're not operating the way you should be held accountable, and there should be mechanisms to have you removed. So that, yeah, there will be a paper later on in the year that deals with that specifically, as Vicky has said. Okay, thank you, Zubair, very much. Cordell, I'm going to move over to you now, if you don't mind. You kind of raised this a little bit in your presentation, and this sort of relates to Marion Barner's question. But before I get to question, I think the issue of effective oversight of culture is that it requires directors to, I think, regularly spend more time on the ground. And again, the adage of nose in, fingers out, but just kind of understanding where business is done, how it is done, in order to gain kind of a broader exposure and a better understanding of the cross-section of employees at their different locations and levels of seniority, how they operate, what they do, etc. Now, and I think where Marion says, how does a new board change a culture of an organization which is well embedded? I would think it's not kind of going into the boardroom and trying to change it. It's getting to understand the organization a little better, getting to understand its people. If you're coming in and you believe the culture isn't the most appropriate culture, you need to have good reason to want it changed and good understanding of the broader business. I mean, how do you see that particular question playing out?
Yeah, I fully agree with you. So I think, firstly, the board does have to make a concerted effort to gain a very good understanding of what is really going on in the organization. And when we're talking about people on the ground, and just reflecting back on what I said earlier, be very, very mindful that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that what we are seeing is what everybody else is seeing. So a key skill, I think, for people in leadership positions, and including boards, is your ability to step out of your own reality, look through the lenses of others, and see what it is that they see, because what they see is their reality. And it's the collective views of realities that actually make up the reality of the organization. Right? So if we go in with a mindset of we can see everything, boom, you're already on the wrong foot. And then in terms of changing the culture, and I agree with what Taruna said earlier on, we have to be mindful that it is not an instant exercise. It takes long to change cultures around, and that how we go about things is really, really important in terms of thinking about the interventions. But I think a very important point in terms of trying to change a culture around is, yes, as leadership, you would ultimately approve what the blueprint should look like for the organization, but be very, very, very careful of a top-down approach. Right? So you want to make sure that it is top-down, bottom-up, and that you have a nice combination of a symbiotic relationship. Because sometimes we look at organizations with we taint the whole organization. There's so much corruption, so the whole organization is corrupt. I was sitting at a dinner the other day, and an investigative journalist made a comment about an organization where I'm involved, and I said, that organization is corrupt from the top to the bottom. And of course, I'm like, oh, but I'm sitting here, what are you saying? Are you saying I'm corrupt? And so here we've got to be very careful also as boards in terms of how we verbalize things. Because if we say to our people, we think you're all corrupt, then that is going to essentially trigger different behavioral patterns in terms of what we really want to see. If you go in with a mindset of the vast majority of your people are actually good people. And why is it that we, in the midst of good people, are seeing what is playing out? Sometimes it's got to do with there's a lot of fear in the organization. Where's the fear points coming from? You can have fear in the organization, but multiple reasons as to why people are afraid. Sometimes they're afraid of leadership. Sometimes they're afraid of criminals. So how do we deal with that? How do we ensure that they are safe? And it's not just sitting in policies, but also in our actions, in how we do things. And having the conversations bottom up, top down, in terms of what it is that we would like to see our organization look like. And you work with the people. You know, I publicly said the other day, the organization is going to be saved by its people, not the board. The board creates the environment, and it's important for us to go in with that mindset. And when you work with the people, then you're able to get to where you want to go to. But I do want to just tag into this a little bit of a conversation that we had earlier on around the shareholder, the ecosystem, public sector. So when you're talking about culture, it's also important to remember that your organization is a microcosm of society to a large extent. It's a living organism because you've got people in there that interacts with the world outside. So you have walls that's got holes in it, right? So there's movement out and there's movement in. What does that mean in relation to the culture? But it functions within a whole ecosystem. And one of the conversations that we should have, for example, is should we be training shareholders? Because how do people become shareholders? And they make hugely important decisions in deciding who's going to sit on that board. But if they do that with mindlessness, or they do it with the bias that has been crafted in their minds over years in terms of what does a good board member look like, then you're going to see that kind of mirroring happening in our organizations. And maybe just lastly around accountability, because I think as South Africans, we really need to think a little deeper around how we think about accountability in relation to when we talk about public sector versus private sector, because what we've essentially done in South Africa is to create a horn effect around the public sector and a halo effect around the private sector. And we think in absolutes, but the world doesn't work in absolutes. And if we start to think more clearly, we'll start to see things like, actually, when you talk about accountability in the public sector, the only reason why we think that there's lack of transparency is because of the Zondos and so forth, but you don't have a Zondo specifically looking at the private sector, and therefore your perception is skewed, right? And we've got to be clear in our heads around that. I had a wonderful, unpleasant surprise for myself the other day, where I ended up sitting in front of a parliamentary committee, and I didn't know that was going to happen to me. Right? So, and as I was going through the process, actually, this doesn't happen to leaders in the private sector. So your accountability is very public. So we need to think about how those kind of things also impact on our cultures. So if you're sitting with a public sector, for example, where as a leader, your chances of being burned are higher, you're taking significantly more risk. You then will have less people with skills flowing in there. And we all South Africans, we part of the process, right? And then that would have a ripple and cascading effect into the organization in terms of its culture.
Thanks, Cordell. I just saw an interesting comment from Fairfair, and it's kind of linked to what you were saying now, around the fear of leadership, the autocrat that sort of impacts, the way we think, and obviously impacts the way in which the culture is defined in the organization. We heard about Steinheist earlier on from Zubair. But I mean, just your view on that, how do you deal with that issue? You get onto a board, and now there's this fear out of the CEO or the board chairman, and immediately has an impact on the culture of the organization.
Yeah. Fear is an interesting thing, and it comes back to that limbic system that I referred to earlier on. And it's one of the areas that I've started to focus on a lot more, because I'm realizing more and more that more often than not, we're driven by fear. And often we don't realize that we are driven by fear. And fear actually has 4 main responses. There are 5, but the 3 that most of us are aware of would be you're either going to fight mode, into flight mode, or into freeze mode. And lots of board members tend to go into freeze mode. But there's also fawn, which most people are not aware of. Fawning is essentially when we do the yes sir thing. And we don't see that as a fear response. So as board members, if you take real responsibility in terms of your fiduciary duty, then we've got to be very careful that we don't allow ourselves to be immobilized by fear, especially not as a collective, but also being able to confront our own fears. Because if you don't confront yourself around your fear, why is it that that fear is there? You are not going to get out of that, and you're not then going to deal with things appropriately. So we go into this learned helplessness thing, and then we say, well, we can't do anything. But the reality is, and I've said this a couple of times in different situations, that our biggest risk as a board in a particular context, it's not always in all contexts, but in particular context that I was talking to, is that the chair is our biggest risk because of what is happening, that autocratic style, right? Our biggest weakness as a board is collectively not controlling that. And we've got to take responsibilities as board members when that plays out. We can't go into, if you're going to sit in court one day and you've got to answer questions as to why decisions were made, you can't say I was afraid of the chair. That's not true. That's not going to fly with a judge. But it really starts with, it comes back to that self-awareness that I was talking about, and being able to confront yourself and understanding your own fear.
100%. Well done. Thank you very much. Thanks, Claudel. Shepherd, have you got a comment to make on what Claudel has been talking through?
Yeah, but not directly. But I have two questions that I read in the question chat, which I thought really touch on the real nuts of the whole question of culture. George Sanga says, what do you do when the chair extends their relationship with top management into after-hours activities? This happens so often. And it's worse when it happens, in fact, when the chair actually chooses, assume that the board has different races on it. Then if the chair chooses to do this with only one race, this even becomes worse because it creates a rift on the board and rips the entire board apart and therefore destroys the culture. So so this, in terms of solutions, I've just been thinking that and whenever it has come up and I've been asked to advise, I've always said, it's good for the chair as leader of the board to avoid excessive socialization with the board members, right? If you, yes, you have to have some degree of socialization, but it should be guided. The annual dinners, etc., and dinners with execs and so on. That's well and good, but always keep your social distance. And if you have to do the socialization, do it in groups rather than within individuals. And the groups must be multiracial or multi-ethnic as much as possible. That's what I would say to that. Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting one. Then Marian said, how does a new board change a culture of an organization? My first question would be, the board must be convinced, A, do they have to change the culture? What is wrong with the culture? The mere fact that you're a new board, you don't have, and you've got your new preferences, does not make it worthwhile that you change the culture. So go through that very elaborate process, and a lot of the stuff, some of the Claudel has given very good pointers to how to follow the process of trying to analyze, do we have to change the culture? And if we really have to, what is the process of having to then sell it? How do we get it to be embedded? And what is the new culture? How do we define it, etc., etc.? Yeah, so I just thought I should lend my way to that.
Thanks, Shepherd. I think those are very good responses to those questions. And I suppose as well with regard to the socializing point, I think what's critical there is the whole board dynamic. And again, not to beat this to death, but the behavioral skill individual should ensure that the board dynamic is such that every individual on the board, including the chairman, understands what impact there will be should they socialize in a particular way. So I think that point is very well taken. I know you just turned your camera off, Shepard. I'm going to ask you to put it back on again, because while we've got you, I just want to, Kosim Tetwa also talks about the board change and the culture and organization where corruption has been institutionalized for years by senior executives, and it has infiltrated to even the employees at the lowest level of the organization, thanks to speakers. But what is your view on that? I mean, how does a board deal with that particular issue? Do you promote change at board level and change at management level? What is your experience in that regard?
It works more effectively if the board is cleaner than management in terms of corruption in this case. So then let's use the starting point that the board will be a lot cleaner than the management. Then the whole aspect of consequence management comes in. The board has to be satisfied that it has a policy framework which it uses as a basis. Otherwise, then they would be opening themselves to all sorts of litigations. Is there a code of conduct, a disciplinary code, and a code of conduct, code of ethics, a whole policy framework that helps the board to say, we are saying this is corrupt because the yardstick of measurement is this one, which is an established policy. If it is not there, the board would be advised to start by establishing that platform first, before then they start accusing management. But if the platform is all in place, then the board should boldly use that. In fact, I would say, in my practice of chairmanship, I always find appointing task teams of a board works a lot more efficiently and quickly than trying to get the whole board involved. So maybe the chair of the Human Resources Committee or the chair of the Social and Ethics Committee, you say, you chair this task team of 4 board members and deep dive into this, report back to the board at such and such intervals and with your recommendations. That's in the limited time, that's how quickly I would recommend they pursue the process.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to Peter Besaidnout. I see that, and it's the same Peter Besaidnout that I knew years ago. Good to meet up again. I see that Zubair has answered your particular question around integrity. I'll try and get to your other question now, but before I do that, Taruna, I'm going to ask, with your role as kind of heading up the business school for PwC, Kiran Maharaj asked that considering the self-awareness and self-knowledge linked to behavior, is the pathway to developing culture, ethics, and values best served by starting at school level with laying the foundation at this early stage? What's your view on that?
So, Anton, yes, I mean, I agree that is where, people's value systems are developed, right? It's quite early on. But I think the reality is, as an organization, we will have individuals join our organizations that have differing value systems. And while, yes, work needs to be put in terms of, ethical foundations at that young age, you are going to get differing value sets, coming into an organization. But so, as an organization, I think where we need to focus is on the articulation of our values. So are we clear on what our purpose is as an organization? Are we clear on expected behaviors so that any individual who enters has a clear understanding of how they are expected to behave and what they are going to be measured against? So, I'd focus the attention there, while agreeing that I think it is a broader societal issue that needs to be dealt with at a younger age.
Great, thanks, Taruna. We are running out of time. I do want each of the panelists to give a quick summary, 2-minute summary. Before we do that, I'm going to go one more question. We'll keep a tab on the other questions, those that haven't been answered, and I'll make sure through Vikesh and her team that one or two of the panelists, the individuals or myself, will answer those questions that have been asked. So the last question, Zubair, I'm going to ask you to answer. You have already answered one part of it, and that's from Peter Besaidnout, in saying he submits that a board should influence culture by deciding the culture pillars, of which one should be integrity. Can they drive organizational culture, or is that in the hands of senior management?
Thanks, Anton. I think actually Claudel answered part of that question also quite nicely in terms of, so Peter's question has, I guess, two components. Is it kind of senior management or the board that sort of drives culture? And, you know, the question around sort of cultural integrity as one of the pillars. So I think on the first question around, is it the board or senior management? I think Claudel talked quite nicely about the fact that we've got to be careful that it's not kind of the, you know, the board at the top there that then kind of, you know, says this is the culture within the organization, and you know, that automatically becomes the culture. I think Claudel and Taruna have talked about the fact that it is a process that takes a little bit of time. But equally, it's something which is built up within the organization. So if we're saying this is something, this is the way in which we do things, then I think that guidance in terms of the way in which we think we should be doing things comes from the board. But equally, there has to be that buy-in from people that are actually kind of doing the things that says, yes, this is the way in which we're actually going to be doing. So I think there is, you know, it's certainly not a one-sided sort of equation. It requires both parties to actually come together. I think on the second part of that question, which is, you know, would kind of cultural pillars be useful? I think you might call it a number of things. You might call it a set of shared values. You might call them cultural pillars, etc. One of the things that I've come to realize is that just because we say integrity is one of our cultural pillars doesn't mean that everybody's going to, you know, adhere to that. So the question that you've got to kind of factor in is, well, how do we actually build these behaviors and encourage these behaviors to ensure that we reach these cultural pillars or these shared values? And so it's those behaviors that actually end up becoming the way in which the culture of the organization is defined. And I think our job as either senior management or, well, actually wherever you are within the organization is to say, how do we build those behaviors so that those behaviors are consistent with where we want to get to?
Great. Thanks, Zubair. As I said, thank you again for your questions. We will get back to those that we haven't answered. I'm going to ask each panelist just to do a quick 2-minute close. Anything that they've learned. I certainly, from my perspective, just listening to this discussion this morning, I think the old adage of, you know, well, that's the way things are done around here is changing. I do think that culture will kind of change the whole context of how we do business into the future from a board and a senior management perspective. And I think 3 key words were highlighted for me this morning, and the one was honesty, the other was respect, and the third was openness. And with that, I'd like to start off with Claudel. If you could give us your 2-minute summary of what you heard, what you saw in the chats, the questions that were asked. Thanks, Claudel.
Thank you. I'll summarize by using an analogy. And the analogy that I often like to use when one talks about a collection of people that organize themselves around certain activities and a culture develops is that of a snowflake. So if you look at a snowflake through a microscope, snowflakes are beautiful and they're all unique. So you don't have 2 snowflakes that look exactly the same. And you can ask the question, so how do the molecules know exactly where to go to form that beautiful picture, right? And in chaos theory, we talk about that strange attractor. So if you think about the organization in terms of that picture that we would like to see emerging when we look through the microscope and really look deep into the organization, what picture is really emerging, and what is that strange attractor? And the strange attractor for me, so we talk about values. Here, I really think that one of the things that we need to think about in organizations is not so much about teaching people rules, and so your code of conduct, your policies and so forth would really enshrine what it is, the behavioral patterns that you would want to see, and they can quite easily be interpreted as rules. But what you want to get to, a mature organization has people in it who understand principles and have the ability to apply their minds around the principles and have deep application of mind and be able to see the various implications and decisions and actions through that lens of principles. And that is how you then create that strange attractor. So you don't direct behavior in terms of instructing people, but people automatically go into that beautiful formation because they understand the principles and they apply the principles. You also, in just maybe one last word around the principles, is when we talk about values, be very, very mindful of the fact that we don't bring our own morality into the picture, because we can quite easily go into this self-righteousness in terms of values that are really attached to our morality. And our morality in itself is not necessarily wrong, but I'll give you a very quick example that would help us to think a little clearly around why it is that we've got to think deeper. So if in your moral code, homosexuality is wrong, because you come, say, from a certain religious persuasion, you can quite easily bring that value into the organization. It may not be in congruence with the ethics of the organization. So think deeper, teach your people to think from a principle perspective and being able to apply their minds very deeply around the principles.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudel. Shepherd, your closing remarks.
Thank you, sir. My two BTIs are: boards must never shy away from taking center stage in creating, communicating, implementing, and preserving culture. And the implementation has only to be effectively done through a very robust delegation of authority framework. Delegation of all the policies to the CEO and cascading further down the organization. And that's the main tool that the board can use to assess whether, in fact, the delegation is working and the culture is, in fact, cascading down. Secondly, the bedrock of positive organizational culture is embedded in one acronym, ICRAFT, which stands for integrity, competence, responsibility, accountability, fairness, and transparency by all the board members, both individually, collectively, as well as the CEO being the executive captain of the organization. I rest my case.
Thank you, Shepherd. Thank you so much. Taruna.
Thanks, Anton. So I think, what I've appreciated from the session is really the learning that culture doesn't happen by accident, right? We need to be intentional about crafting our culture around recrafting it and take the active steps that are required and put in the incredible hard work that is required to continuously work on improving the culture within an organization.
Thank you, Taruna. Zubair.
Thanks, Anton. I think my kind of lessons are actually around, probably best explained by sort of a short story, and it will be a short story. So a dad kind of walks into the house and sees all of his kids, on their phones, and so he says, this is completely unacceptable. When we're talking to each other, we need to make sure that we're not on our phones. Half an hour later, kind of they're talking to him and he's busy on his phone, and that's kind of just the way in which things work. And I think for me, the point that I kind of take away from that is that we're not going to lead people not only by putting rules and processes in place. The way in which we lead people is leading them by example. So in the case of the dad, certainly the example that he's setting by sort of just not being present and being on his phone when that's not what's expected, I think then sets the tone. And it's that tone that then becomes the reality. That's the tone that becomes the culture within the organization. And so for me, it's about actually walking the talk, as I think one of the people in the webinar chat kind of said, instead of just basing it on the rules and the processes in place. And then I think the last thing for me is that it really is, and linked to the first point, it really is sort of an outcomes-based exercise. So it's not about what you put in place. What are the outcomes that I'm expecting? And I think one of the key things there is about realizing that the world is changing, society is changing, and so our organizational cultures are going to change as time goes on, and we've got to be prepared to be agile and adapt to that situation. Thanks, Anton.
Yeah, 100% right. I think Mark Telfer mentioned it right early on in the chat that it's all about tone at the top. So fully agree with you. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to the presenters. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time. I'm going to hand over now to Vicky to close the session.
Sorry, I think a little bit of a technical issue there. Thank you so much, Anton, and thank you to all our panelists and attendees this morning. I think it was a brilliant session. I'm hoping you can see the screen. Please do give us some inputs on the event and what you felt worked well. You can look out for our next two events coming up on the 12th of July. We'll be looking at UMSA's risk report. And on the 22nd of August, we're launching our linking ESG to remuneration paper. So those are the two technical topics you can look out for coming up in the next couple of weeks. So have a wonderful rest of the week, everyone. And we'll see you again for one of our next Board Governance Forum paper launches. Take care.